The United States has more than 2 billion acres of land within its borders. The vast majority of this land, over 60%, is held privately. That includes the land your house or apartment is on, and it might include the land where you work. Other landowners in the United States include state and local governments and Native American tribes. But another enormous chunk belongs to the federal government. Within individual states, the amount of federal land varies. In Connecticut, they own less than 1% of the land, but in Nevada, they own more than 80%. Overall, they own about 640 million acres of land in the United States, about 28% of the total. Of course, this percentage used to be much larger. The federal government acquired large swaths of land west of the Mississippi in the 19th century. But to encourage settlement there, the federal government sold and/or gave away that land. Since the 1780s, the federal government has transferred more than 1 billion acres out of the public domain and into private hands. That land went to private individuals through homesteading laws, it went to railroads as part of land grants, it went to states, it went to local governments. But, as you know, the West is big. Really big. The 11 western states collectively contain more than 750 million acres of land. If you add Alaska, that's another 365 million acres. Even with the generous land settlement laws, the vast majority of the West remained unsettled. So when the federal government quote-unquote closed the frontier and decided to hold on to the land it had left, it still owned 45% of the land in those western states. That number is 60% in Alaska. Managing that land is no simple task, and the federal government has a diverse array of bureaucratic agencies to help it do so. But by far, 4 of them do the heavy lifting. They include the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service. Together, those 4 agencies manage 94% of the federal land portfolio, 606.5 million acres. With that being said, I'm going to give you a quick overview of those land management agencies, what they do, how they're organized, how they operate, and most importantly, how they manage the lands they're responsible for. We're going to go smallest portfolio to largest, starting with the National Park Service. I'm not going to go into too much detail for each of these. This is really just a survey of the main agencies that are responsible for managing our public lands. I figured for a channel that makes videos about public lands issues, it would be worthwhile to take some time to talk about who maintains them. If you would like something a little more detailed on any one of these agencies, feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Now, first off, if you look at the legislation which governs each of these agencies, you might be forgiven for thinking they all do the same thing. They all talk about managing natural resources, accommodating multiple users, and really just managing land. But as you'll see, each of these agencies does have a specific function and a specific management direction. They all, more or less, are still responsible for the original resource they were tasked with overseeing. So the Bureau of Land Management oversees most of the grazing on public lands, the Forest Service oversees most of the logging and forest resources, the Fish and Wildlife oversees, well, the fish and the wildlife, and the Park Service oversees the parks. So yes, they all have this kind of overarching goal of resource protection, but each of them also have their own flair for how they handle that. Alright, to start off with, let's talk about the National Park Service, which comes up the most on this channel and is probably the agency most people are familiar with. Despite its popularity, National Park saw nearly 300 million visitors in 2021. The Park Service actually manages the least amount of land of the big 4 agencies. It manages just 79.9 million acres, or 12% of the federal portfolio. 2/3 of that land is in Alaska, 52.5 million acres. As of April 2022, the National Park System encompasses 424 units, 63 of which carry the actual National Park designation. If you'd like to learn about each of the National Park designations, you can check out my first ever video on them, which I'll link to down below. Out of those 424 units though, just 8 of them account for 1/4 of national park visitation, less than 2% of the system's total. The Park Service is divided into 12 regions and manages land in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and Guam. Their land management policies are some of the strictest in the federal portfolio, with extractive uses generally not accepted. As far as management challenges go, the main one for the Park Service actually arises from the very legislative mandate which created it. This is known as the dual mandate and tasks the Park Service with preserving and protecting the resources it manages, while simultaneously making those resources available for the public to enjoy. As we all know, those two things don't always go hand in hand. More people puts more strain on resources, but limiting those people means not as many will experience, learn about, and enjoy those resources. It's a delicate balancing act, and it's the main task for the National Park Service. Next up is the Fish and Wildlife Service, who tend to be talked about more for their wildlife management policies than for the land they actually manage. I won't be touching on those policies in this video, but instead focusing on the system of National Wildlife Refuges they administer. Altogether, the Fish and Wildlife Service manages 89.2 million acres, or 13% of the federal portfolio. Again, like the Park Service, a majority of this acreage is in Alaska, where 85% of their portfolio is located, including the gargantuan 19 million acre Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. In total, the Fish and Wildlife Service oversees 548 total wildlife refuges, plus 205 waterfowl production areas and 49 wildlife coordination areas, for a grand total of 802 units. The first National Wildlife Refuge was created on Pelican Island, Florida, but the overall system was not created until 1966. The Fish and Wildlife Service is organized into 7 regional offices, with each regional director having relative autonomy in how to govern their respective refuges. As for management, the main goal of the Fish and Wildlife Service is to protect lands and waters to help conserve plants and animals. The National Wildlife Refuge system is the so-called infrastructure that has been put in place to do this. Now, other uses are allowed in National Wildlife Refuges, but they are supposed to be assessed based on how much impact they will have on the refuge. As you can imagine, the definition of impact depends on who you talk to, and this creates the bulk of the management challenges for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Taken together, the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service lean more toward conservation/preservation management styles, as defined in the legislation that governs them. Contrast that with the management styles of the next 2 agencies, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. They operate under a management style that is known as multiple-use sustained yield, meaning they are tasked with managing land to accommodate several different uses to, quote, maximize the benefit to the American people, while also ensuring that the use of those resources is sustainable in the long term. With that being said, let's talk about the Forest Service. This is the only one of the 4 agencies which is located under the Department of Agriculture, not Interior. Several attempts have been made to move the Forest Service to Interior, but so far nothing has come of it. That speaks to how national forests are viewed and reaffirms the doctrine of multiple-use sustained yield. National forests are viewed mainly through the lens of harvesting and extraction, much like crops are. Now, national forests themselves actually predate the Forest Service that governs them. Their precursors, the forest reserves, were created in 1891 to protect land, preserve the flow of water, and, of course, extract timber. At that time, the forest reserves were part of the Department of Interior under the General Land Office. But in 1905, the Forest Service was created and the national forests were moved to the Department of Agriculture. Overall, the Forest Service oversees 30% of the federal land portfolio with 192.9 million acres. That includes 155 national forests, 20 national grasslands, and 123 other areas, divided between 9 regional offices. As I mentioned, the Forest Service's management strategy focuses on multiple-use sustained yield. They try and balance uses like timber harvesting, recreation, mining, grazing, hunting, fishing, etc. And they try and make sure those uses can continue well into the future. Notice that this is not purely a preservation mindset. Extraction plays a big role in how national forests are managed, much like it does for the federal government's largest land manager, the Bureau of Land Management. They oversee 244.4 million acres, or 38% of the entire federal portfolio. 99% of that acreage is in the western United States and Alaska. They were technically created in 1946 through the merging of 2 prior agencies, the Federal Grazing Service and the General Land Office. Together, they oversaw what was left of the public domain after it was closed to settlement and was otherwise not managed by any other agency. That's pretty much why they oversee the largest amount of land. Now again, they operate under a multiple use sustained yield management strategy. Like the Forest Service, BLM lands allow mining, grazing, logging, recreation, and conservation uses, among others. Issues arise from trying to balance all of these uses. In particular, two uses tend to attract the most controversy on BLM lands: grazing and mining. 65% of BLM lands are open to cattle grazing, and questions are often asked about the economics of cattle grazing on public land, the ecological impacts associated with it, and the invasive species it introduces. As for mining, the BLM oversees more than 700 million acres of subsurface mineral rights, the extraction of which tends to be at odds with other uses allowed on BLM lands like recreation and conservation. In the end, all four of these agencies operate under different mandates. They manage land in different ways and produce different results by doing so. The decisions they make not only give me plenty of topics to make videos about, but they give rise to very complex issues. Issues that have no easy solutions. Issues that require dedication, discussion, and compromise to resolve. I realize this may not have been the most exciting topic for the channel, but I do think it's a vitally important one. We need to understand who is making public lands decisions on our behalf, and we need to be able to communicate effectively about them. I hope that by making a video about these four agencies, you'll now have the ability to do that. After all, these are our lands, public lands. We get a say in how they're run. If you'd like to learn more about the world's protected places, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me bring more park stories like this one to more people. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.